The wind screamed across the frozen wasteland like a living thing, hungry and cruel. In the distance, a tiny spark of light flickered against the darkness. A fire so small it seemed ready to die at any moment. That tiny flame was all that stood between life and death, the two souls lost in the endless white hell. Liren had felt the weight of exile long before the words were spoken. She had seen it coming in the way people looked at her, or rather, how they stopped looking at her altogether. The quiet judgment in their eyes, the way they turned away when she passed, the hushed whispers that followed her like shadows. Her name, once spoken with respect, now carried the taste of something sour, something wrong. She had tried to fool herself into believing she could still belong, that somehow, despite everything, she could still be useful to her people. She had clung to hope like a drowning woman clutches driftwood, desperate and fierce. That deep in her heart, where the truth lived in cold, hard silence, she had always known what was coming. She was a widow without a bond. A woman who had survived when nature itself said she should not have. In the eyes of the Varon, she was an impossibility, a walking reminder that their most sacred beliefs might be wrong. The decision came in the traditional way of her people, wrapped in silence like a burial shroud. There were no angry voices, no heated arguments, no dramatic accusations thrown across council chambers. Just the high elders standing before her in their flowing ceremonial robes, their luminous silver eyes as cold and empty as the void between stars. The judgment hall felt different that day. The air itself seemed thicker, pressing down on her shoulders like invisible hands. The carved symbols on the walls, symbols that had once felt like home, now seemed to watch her with alien interest. Even the light from the crystal chandeliers felt harsh, too bright, making her skin look pale and sickly. "You are to leave." 3 words. Simple. Final. Like the closing of a door that would never open again. No trial. No chance to speak in her own defense. No appeal to higher powers or ancient laws. Just 3 words that cut through her life like a blade through flesh. She had pleaded then, not for herself. She had already accepted her fate, but for her son. He was innocent in all this. He had done nothing wrong except exist. He didn't deserve to be cast out into the frozen darkness because of what she had become. His fate is yours to bear, the elders had said, their voices echoing in the vast chamber like the tolling of funeral bells. And that was the end of it. No more discussion, no more mercy. The decision was made, carved in stone and sealed with the authority of generations. They had given her only what she could carry, a mockery of kindness. A small ration pack that would last perhaps 3 days. A thermal blanket thin as paper. A knife that was more ceremony than weapon. Its blade, pretty but useless. And a single fire starter, the kind given to children learning to camp. Barely enough to last one night. The walk to the transport bay felt like a funeral march. The cold, clinical halls of Varel Prime stretched before her like a maze of metal and glass, each step echoing with the finality of her situation. Other Varon passed by, their faces carefully blank, their eyes looking anywhere but at her. She was already dead to them, already gone. She hadn't fought as they escorted her to the shuttle. What would have been the point? Fighting would only prove them right that she was unstable, dangerous, a threat to the natural order. Better to go quietly, to maintain what little dignity she had left. The ship had launched without ceremony, just another small craft disappearing into the vast darkness of space. She had cradled her son during the descent, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Promises about warmth and safety, and a future that seemed more impossible with each passing moment. Then the hatch had opened, and the cold had swallowed them whole. Now, 3 days later, she huddled near the dying fire she had built with her own hands. The flames danced weakly, their golden light barely strong enough to hold back the crushing darkness that surrounded them. Every gust of wind threatened to snuff them out completely, and she curved her body around the fire like a shield, protecting it with her life. Her son lay beside her, wrapped in what remained of her cloak. The fabric was torn and dirty, stained, with blood from her cut fingers and ash from the fire. His small chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths that sent puffs of mist into the freezing air. His green skin, once vibrant and healthy, now had a grey tinge that made her heart race with fear. Too cold, too weak, too close to the edge. Liran pulled the fabric tighter around him, her fingers aching from the frost that had settled into her bones. She had nothing left to give him, no more blankets, no more food, no more warmth. The rations had run out yesterday, and she had already burned every piece of spare cloth she could find. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She looked down at herself, taking inventory of what remained. Her thin tunic clung to her body like a second skin, the fabric stiff with frost and brittle from the cold. It had been designed for the warm, comfortable corridors of Varel Prime, not the frozen wasteland of this forgotten planet. But it would burn. It would keep the fire alive a little longer. Her hands shook as she reached for the hem of her tunic. The fabric felt strange under her fingers, fragile, almost alive. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that once she started down this path, there would be no going back. But her son stirred in his sleep, making a small sound of distress, and the choice was made. She pulled the ceremonial knife from her belt, hissing as the metal touched her skin. It was so cold it burned, leaving white marks on her fingers. The blade was dull, meant for ritual rather than practical use, but it would serve. She began cutting away strips of fabric, each slice deliberate and careful. She couldn't afford to waste even a thread. The fire hissed and crackled as she fed it the offerings, the flames consuming the cloth with greedy hunger. Heat surged outward, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt hope. A hint of color returned to her son's cheeks, and his breathing seemed to steady. She exhaled slowly, relief mixing with despair in her chest. This fire wouldn't last long, and when it died, there would be nothing left. She had already given everything she could spare. Soon, she would have to start giving things she couldn't spare. She pulled her son closer, pressing her lips to his forehead. His skin was still too cold, but warmer than before. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered into his hair. "Please just stay with me." His small fingers twitched, and his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Cold." "I know, sweetheart," she murmured, forcing her voice to stay steady. "But we're going to be warm soon. I promise." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But sometimes lies were all you had left. A gust of wind howled through the darkness, and the fire wavered dangerously. Liran reached for another strip of fabric, but before she could cut it, something moved in the shadows beyond the fire's reach. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her tired mind. The snow swirled and danced in patterns that could fool the eye, especially when you were as exhausted as she was. But then she saw it again, a tall figure, half hidden by the storm, moving with purpose through the white chaos. Her mind raced through possibilities. A raider? No, they wouldn't waste their time on a dying exile and her child. There was nothing here worth taking, nothing to gain from attacking someone who was already dead. A beast? The movement was too controlled, too deliberate. Beasts hunted with instinct, not strategy. Then the figure stepped closer, and she saw the truth. the thick furs wrapped around broad shoulders, the heavy boots that crunched through the snow with confidence. The unmistakable presence of something alien, something that didn't belong in her world. A human. She recoiled instinctively, pulling her son closer to her chest. Humans were dangerous, that was what she had been taught from birth. They were uncivilized, violent, driven by primitive instincts that civilized beings had long since evolved beyond. They were warriors and killers, a species that thrived on conflict and bloodshed. She had never seen one in person until now. The human stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the frost coating his dark hair, the steady clouds of breath that puffed from his lips in the freezing air. He was enormous, taller and broader than any Varon she had ever known. His frame wrapped in layers of heavy fur that made him look like some kind of ancient god of winter. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind howled around them, and the fire crackled between them like a tiny barrier holding back the darkness. Lion's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost black, in the firelight, and they studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She waited for him to speak, to make some demand or threat. She waited for the violence her people had warned her about. Instead, he slowly reached up and began unfastening his coat. Liran tensed, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run. This was the moment when the human would reveal his true nature. She had expected a weapon, a blade or gun, or some other instrument of death, something to confirm everything she had been taught about his kind. But instead, he pulled off his thick outer coat and extended it toward her. She flinched backward, almost losing her balance. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely opposite to everything she had been told, that her mind struggled to process it. He was offering it to her. A human was offering her help. She hesitated, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Accepting anything from a human was unthinkable. It went against every teaching, every warning, every story she had ever heard. But the fire was dying, and her son was slipping away from her. She could feel his life ebbing with each shallow breath. Fingers shook as she reached for the coat. Their hands brushed for just an instant as she took it, and a strange warmth lingered on her skin, a heat that was more than just physical. She quickly wrapped the coat around her child, pulling him close as his small body instinctively curled into the warmth. The human watched her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he crouched near the fire, his sharp eyes taking in her stripped-down tunic, the remnants of fabric feeding the flames. "You burned your clothes to keep him warm," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel grinding together, but there was something else in it. Not the cruelty she had expected, but something that might have been respect. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and confusion, and a desperate gratitude she didn't want to feel. He exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "You'll die like this," he said simply. It wasn't a threat or a judgment, just a statement of fact delivered with the same tone he might have used to comment on the weather. Liran stiffened. She already knew that. She had known it from the moment the ship's hatch had opened and the cold had rushed in to claim them. But hearing it spoken aloud, especially by a human, made it feel more real somehow. When he spoke again, there was something else in his voice, something that made her pulse quicken with unease. "You have two choices," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Stay here and freeze." The fire crackled between them, a dying heartbeat in the vast silence of the frozen world. She could feel the heat fading already, the flames growing smaller and weaker with each passing moment. "Or come with me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Liran moved slowly, her stiff joints protesting as she pulled herself to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from cold and exhaustion, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. But she forced herself to stand upright, forced herself to meet his gaze with what little dignity she had left. The human was watching her intently, his expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his attention, the way he seemed to be measuring her strength, her resolve, her will to survive. "I'll go with you," she said finally, the words tasting like defeat in her mouth. Something in his posture relaxed, but only slightly. He nodded once, a sharp movement that spoke of decisions made and paths chosen. Liran hesitated, then lifted her chin in a gesture that was equal parts defiance and desperation. "But if you try to hurt my son," she said, her voice barely above, a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "I will kill you." For the first time since he had appeared, the human's lips curved into what might have been amusement. "Okay," he said simply, and somehow in that single word, she heard something that might have been a promise. The cold never truly left her, even wrapped in the heavy human coat. It had settled into her bones like a living thing, creeping through her muscles and making every step feel like walking through thick mud. Liran felt the frost biting at her skin, sinking deep beneath the surface where warmth should have lived. Her body ached in ways she had never experienced, a bone-deep exhaustion that made her want to simply lie down in the snow and sleep forever. But she forced herself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, following the broad figure cutting through the deep snow ahead of her. Daniel, that was what he had called himself when she had finally worked up the courage to ask. The name felt strange on her tongue, foreign and rough like everything else about him. He hadn't said much since she had accepted his offer. Every so often he would pause and glance back at her, checking to make sure she was still following, still alive. His eyes would sweep over her, and the bundle in her arms with the same careful attention he gave to the treacherous path ahead. She couldn't tell if he was being kind or simply practical, making sure his investment didn't die before they reached wherever they were going. She didn't trust him. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not with a human. But he had warmth, shelter, and protection. And right now those things mattered more than her fear or her people's warnings. Survival came first. Everything else was secondary. Her son remained bundled against her chest, his small body pressed close to her heart. She could feel the faint rhythm of his breathing through the thick coat. Still too shallow. Still too weak. The fire back at their makeshift camp had helped. But not enough. He needed real warmth, not the desperate, flickering heat of burning clothes and dying hope. She listened to each breath he took, counting them like prayers. In and out. In and out. Each one a small victory against the cold that wanted to claim him. His green skin had lost some of its grey tinge, but he was still too pale, too fragile. She needed to get him somewhere safe, somewhere warm, before it was too late. The landscape around them was endless and hostile. Snow stretched in every direction, broken only by jagged formations of ice and the occasional dark shadow of buried ruins. The wind never stopped howling, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone foolish enough to challenge it. This was a world that hated life, that fought against anything that dared to exist on its surface. How did humans survive here? How did anyone survive here? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel came to a sudden stop. The wind tugged at his fur-lined hood as he surveyed the terrain ahead, his eyes scanning the white expanse with the practiced gaze of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of danger. Liran followed his gaze, trying to see what he saw. There a dark shape rising from the snow in the distance. At first glance, it looked like just another jagged formation of ice, another cruel sculpture carved by the endless wind. But as they drew closer, she began to make out details that didn't belong to nature. Straight lines, metal edges, the unmistakable geometry of something built by intelligent hands. Old research outpost, Daniel said, his voice gruff and matter-of-fact. Or what's left of one. Leran stared at the structure, if it could even be called that anymore. Time and weather had not been kind to it. The roof was barely visible beneath a thick crust of ice and snow, and the walls looked ready to collapse. At any moment, it was a ruin, a skeleton of whatever it had once been. It's not safe, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Daniel turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised in what might have been amusement. Safe? He repeated. Lady, there's nothing safe about this place. But it's shelter, and shelter is what we need right now. He was right, of course. They had no other choice. The alternative was to keep walking through the storm until they both collapsed from exhaustion. At least the ruins would block some of the wind, give them a place to rest and build a proper fire. Daniel moved first, testing the entrance with careful steps. The ice held under his weight, and he gestured for her to follow. Leran clutched her, sun tighter, and stepped inside, her boots crunching on the frozen debris that littered the floor. The space was small, little more than a shell of what it had once been. The walls were dark metal, scarred and pitted from years of abuse by wind and weather. The ceiling had cracked open in several places, letting in shafts of grey light that illuminated the snowdrifts piled along the edges. But the center of the room was relatively clear, and most importantly, it blocked the endless howling of the wind. The silence felt almost oppressive after so long in the storm. Leran could hear her own heartbeat, her son's shallow breathing, the soft whisper of snow settling on the metal roof. It was the first time in days that she had been able to think clearly, without the constant noise of the wind drowning out her thoughts. Daniel dropped his pack near what had once been a workstation, the metal surface now covered in a thick layer of frost. He crouched down and began pulling items from his bag, kindling, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep it dry, and a small, battered fire starter, the same kind she had been given before her exile, though his looked well used and reliable. How long have you been out here? He asked, not looking up from his work. The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on survival that she had almost forgotten time existed in any meaningful way. Days blurred together in the endless white. 3 days, she said finally, moving to the far wall and lowering herself carefully onto the frozen floor. Her son stirred weakly in her arms, shifting as she tucked him deeper into the warmth of Daniel's coat. His small face was peaceful in sleep, but she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his lips had a faint blue tinge despite the warmth. You wouldn't have lasted 4, Daniel said simply, striking the fire starter with practiced efficiency. Leran bristled at his tone, but she couldn't argue with the truth. She had known it herself, known that they were living on borrowed time, that each hour might be their last. The fire flared to life, a small but steady glow in the dim ruins, and she felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in days. She edged closer to the flames, holding her hands out toward the warmth. Her fingers were numb, her nails tinged with a faint blue that spoke of frostbite beginning to set in. But the heat felt like a miracle, like the first breath of air after drowning. Her son stirred again, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal tired, unfocused violet eyes. He turned his head slightly, taking in their new surroundings with the quiet curiosity of a child who had learned not to expect comfort from the world. His gaze settled on Daniel, and Leran felt her muscles tense. Mama, the child mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Who ... He didn't finish the question, but he didn't need to. Laran had taught him the word long ago, back when she had never expected to see one with her own eyes. Back when humans were just stories told in hushed tones among her people warnings. About the dangerous species that lived beyond the borders of civilized space. But her son was too young for the kind of fear that had been drilled into her since childhood. His small, chilled fingers curled into the thick fabric of Daniel's coat, and he looked at the human with more curiosity than terror. Daniel let out a low breath, something that might have been amusement flickering across his features. "I guess that's me," he muttered, feeding more kindling to the growing fire. Laran felt something tighten in her chest, mixture of unease and something else she couldn't quite name. He wasn't what she had expected. He should have been cruder, more violent, more like the stories she had been told. Humans were supposed to be driven by base instincts, unable to control their primitive urges. But so far, Daniel had done nothing but offer help when she needed it most. That didn't mean she trusted him. Trust was earned, and she had learned long ago that survival meant being suspicious of everyone, even those who claimed to want to help. A deep rumble shook the walls of their shelter, and Laran went rigid. The sound was low and threatening, like thunder rolling across the frozen landscape. But it wasn't thunder, it was something else, something alive and hungry. Daniel reacted instantly, his hand moving to the long, jagged knife at his belt as he rose to his feet. The relaxed, almost casual demeanor he had shown before was gone, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. Laran felt every muscle in her body tense as the predator instincts that had kept her alive for 3 days kicked in. "Stay here, Daniel," said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from experience with violence. Laran didn't argue. She wrapped herself around her son, pressing him close to her chest as Daniel moved toward the entrance. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment she could see the ruins for what they truly were: not shelter, but a trap. If something came through that entrance, there would be nowhere to run. The sound came again, closer this time, a heavy, dragging noise, like something massive moving through the snow, just outside their fragile sanctuary. Whatever it was big, and it was hungry. Daniel had almost reached the entrance when the creature struck. It came through the doorway like a force of nature, a blur of motion and fury that sent ice and snow spraying across the room. The firelight caught the gleam of thick, mottled fur, the flash of curved talons that could tear through metal, the burning red eyes of something that had been built for killing. A tundra beast. Laran had seen them before, in the nature documentaries they showed to children on Varel Prime. Massive predators perfectly adapted to this frozen hell, with jaws strong enough to crush bone and claws that could shred through the thickest armor. They were the apex predators of this world, and they were always hungry. Daniel barely had time to react before the creature lunged at him. Lion watched in horrified fascination as he twisted aside, his movements surprisingly fast despite the weight of his heavy furs. The beast's claws raked across the metal wall where his head had been just a moment before, leaving deep gouges in the steel. The creature snarled, a sound like grinding stone that made Laran's bones ache. Its massive bulk slammed against the wall with a force that made the entire structure shudder and groan. For a moment she thought the roof might collapse and bury them all. But Daniel was already moving. He flowed around the creature's next attack, like water, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. The blade flashed in the firelight, burying itself deep in the beast's shoulder. Dark blood sprayed across the snow. Steaming in the cold air. The creature let out a bone-rattling screech that made Laran's ears ring. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He drove the blade deeper, twisting it with brutal efficiency before wrenching it free. The beast staggered, its massive form swaying as shock and blood loss began to take their toll. It made one last desperate lunge, its jaws snapping at Daniel's throat. But the human was ready. He stepped inside the creature's reach and drove his knife up under its chin, finding the soft spot where skull met spine. The beast's eyes went wide with surprise and pain, and then it collapsed in a heap of fur and blood. Silence fell over the ruins like a blanket. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Liran realized. She had been holding her breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. Daniel stood over the creature's body, rolling his shoulders as he wiped the blood from his blade. His movements were calm and methodical, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable in the shifting firelight. That was ... Liran searched for the right words, something to describe what she had just witnessed. The speed, the violence, the absolute lack of hesitation. Barbaric, she finished finally. Daniel snorted, a sound that might have been laughter. It worked, he said simply. And that was the problem, wasn't it? It had worked. The creature was dead and they were alive. In the harsh mathematics of survival, that was all that mattered. But watching Daniel fight had been like watching something from the old stories, something primal and savage that civilized beings were supposed to have evolved beyond. Yet here she was, alive because of that savagery, protected by the very violence her people claimed to despise. She didn't argue with him. She couldn't. Instead, she pulled her son closer and listened to the crackling fire, pretending it was the only warmth she felt in this frozen hell. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something else growing inside her. Something that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man, who had just saved their lives with nothing but a knife and the will to use it. And that terrified her more than any tundra beast ever could. The journey to Daniel's shelter felt like walking through a dream or perhaps a nightmare. The landscape shifted and changed around them, but it all looked the same. Endless white, endless cold, endless sky that pressed down on them like a grey blanket, heavy with the promise of more snow to come. Liran's legs had long since stopped, feeling like they belonged to her. Each step was an act of pure will, her muscles moving more from habit than strength. The weight of her son in her arms was both a burden and a blessing, something that kept her focused, kept her moving forward, when everything else wanted to give up. Daniel walked ahead of her, his pace steady and unaffected by the conditions that were slowly killing her. She watched him move through the storm like he was part of it, like he had been born to this frozen wasteland. His footsteps were sure and confident, following paths that were invisible to her, but clear as daylight to him. How long had he been out here? How long had he been surviving in this place that seemed designed to destroy everything that lived? Not much farther, he called back to her, his voice carrying easily over the wind. Just over the next ridge. Liran nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her breath came in short, sharp puffs that crystallized in the air before being whipped away by the wind. Every breath hurt, the cold air burning her lungs and making her chest feel tight and heavy. Her son stirred in her arms, his small face turning toward her with eyes that were too bright, too knowing for someone so young. He had been through too much already, seen too much pain and fear. Children his age should be playing games and learning their letters, not fighting for survival in a frozen hell. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Are we going to be okay?" The question hit her like a physical blow. How could she answer that? How could she make promises she wasn't sure she could keep? But looking into his trusting eyes, she found the strength to lie with conviction. "Yes, little one," she said, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We're going to be fine." She hoped she was right. She hoped that Daniel was leading them to safety and not deeper into danger. She hoped that her trust in a human creature people had taught her to fear wouldn't be the last mistake she ever made. The ridge Daniel had mentioned came into view as they crested a small hill. The structure beyond it was low and squat, half buried in snow and ice. It looked more like a natural formation than something built by hands. But as they got closer, Loran could see the telltale signs of construction. Straight lines, right angles, the subtle geometry that spoke of intelligence and purpose. "Home sweet home," Daniel said, the first hint of humor she had heard in his voice. It wasn't much to look at. The building was small and weathered, its metal walls streaked with rust, and scarred by years of exposure to the elements. Snow had drifted against the sides, creating natural ramps that led up to the partially buried windows. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. But it was shelter. It was safety. It was a place where they could rest and get warm and maybe, just maybe, figure out what to do next. Daniel led them to what she assumed was the front door, though it was so covered in ice that it was hard to tell. He put his shoulder against it and pushed, the metal groaning in protest before finally giving way. The door swung open with a sound like breaking glass, revealing a dark interior that seemed to swallow their breath. The air inside was thick with dust and the lingering scent of old machinery. It smelled like metal and rust and something else, something organic that made her nose wrinkle. But it was dry, and more importantly, it was out of the wind. Lyran stepped inside and immediately felt the difference. The temperature was still cold, but it was a different kind of cold. Not the biting, living cold of the outside world, but the simple absence of warmth. It was cold she could work with, cold she could fight. Snow had crept in through cracks in the walls, forming small drifts in the corners like miniature mountain ranges. The floor was covered in a layer of frost that crunched under their feet, and she could see her breath in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. But it was shelter. It was safety. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Daniel moved quickly and efficiently, like a man who had done this before. He shrugged off his pack and began clearing a space in the center of the room, pushing aside debris and sweeping away the worst of the frost with his boot. Then he pulled out his fire-making materials, kindling, tinder, and that reliable fire starter that had served him so well. Loran sank to the ground against the far wall, her back pressed against the cold metal. The moment she stopped moving, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. Her entire body felt heavy, like she was made of lead instead of flesh and bone. She wanted nothing more than to close her eyes and sleep for a week. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not while her son still needed. She looked down at the small bundle in her arms. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and regular for the first time in days. The color had returned to his cheeks, and his skin felt warm to the touch. Daniel's coat had saved his life, she was sure of it. The fire caught with a soft whoosh, flames dancing upward and casting dancing shadows on the walls. Heat began to spread through the room, and Loran felt something inside her chest loosen. For the first time since the exile, she felt like she could breathe properly. "Better?" Daniel asked, settling down across from her, with his back against the opposite wall. "Better," she agreed, and meant it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind howl outside. It felt good to be still, to not have to fight for every step, to not have to worry about the next gust of wind or the next patch of treacherous ice. Her son stirred in her arms, his eyes fluttering open to reveal those bright violet irises that marked him as her child. He looked around the room with quiet curiosity, taking in the new surroundings with the adaptability that children seem to possess naturally. "Hungry," he said simply, and Loran felt her heart sink. She had nothing left to give him. The last of their rations had been consumed yesterday, and she had been putting off thinking about what would happen when the hunger became too much to ignore. How long could a child his age survive without food? How long before weakness turned to sickness, and sickness turned to something worse? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar. He tossed it to her without ceremony, the same way he might have thrown a stick to a dog. The casual gesture should have been insulting, but Liran was too grateful to care about pride. She caught the bar and examined it carefully. It was military issue. She thought the kind of high-energy, high-protein food designed to keep soldiers functioning under extreme conditions. The packaging was worn and faded, but the seal was intact. "Is it safe?" she asked, hating how uncertain her voice sounded. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I've been eating them for 2 years," he said. "Haven't died yet." That was reassuring, she supposed. She tore open the packaging and broke off a small piece, pressing it to her son's lips. He accepted it without complaint, chewing slowly and carefully. The texture was dense and chewy, nothing like the refined foods they had eaten on Varel Prime. But it was food. It was sustenance. It was life. She took a bite herself, forcing it down despite the dryness. Her body needed it, even if her mind rebelled against accepting charity from a human. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when her son's life hung in the balance. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words tasting strange in her mouth. Daniel just nodded, settling back against the wall with an ease that she envied. How could he be so relaxed? They were still in danger, still at the mercy of the elements and the creatures that hunted in the darkness. But he looked like he was settling in for a pleasant evening by the fire. "You didn't ask," she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Daniel tilted his head, waiting for her to continue. "Why I was out there," she clarified. "Why I was left to die. Most people would want to know." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they held the answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost philosophical. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to," he said. "Everyone's got their reasons for ending up in places like this. Some of them are good reasons, some of them aren't. But they're your reasons, and that's what matters." She hadn't expected that. Most people, Varon or human, it didn't matter, always wanted to know. Always wanted to dig into things that weren't theirs to uncover, to judge and categorize, and decide whether someone deserved their fate or not. But Daniel just waited, as if her past didn't change anything for him. As if it didn't matter whether she was a criminal or a victim or something in between. She was here, now, and that was enough. The words came slower than she had expected, pulled from deep places she had tried to keep locked away. "My people, we're bound by biology," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the truth. "Neural compression, reinforced by chemical compatibility. Once bonded, two become one." She paused, watching Daniel's face for signs of judgment or disgust. But his expression remained neutral, attentive but not invasive. "When one dies," she continued, "the other follows. It's always been that way. It's not a choice, it's nature. Or at least that's what we were told." Daniel frowned, and she could see him working through the implications. He paused, searching for the right words. "That's messed up." Liran's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not a belief," she said, her voice sharp with old pain. "It's science. It's the way our bodies work, the way our minds connect. When my bondmate died, I should have died with him. The fact that I didn't, it means I'm broken, unnatural. a violation of the natural order. "But you're alive," Daniel said simply. "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. "I'm alive. And that makes me dangerous. A threat to everything my people believe about themselves and their place in the universe." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of her confession settling between them like a third presence in the room. She had never spoken the truth out loud before, not to anyone. On Varel Prime, everyone had known without her having to explain. Here, in this frozen wasteland, the words felt both liberating and terrifying. "Did you love him?" Daniel asked suddenly. The question caught her completely off guard. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could she explain something so complicated to someone who had never experienced bonding? How could she make him understand the difference between love and biological imperative? "I was chosen for him," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "We were a match. Compatible genetics, compatible neural patterns, compatible social standings. Love was ... irrelevant." Daniel's expression darkened. "That's not love," he said. "That's breeding." The bluntness of his words should have offended her, but instead, they felt like a revelation. She had never thought of it that way before. But he was right. What she had shared with her bondmate hadn't been love. It had been biological programming, social expectation, and the illusion of choice where none actually existed. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it was all I knew. All any of us knew. And now?" She looked down at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Now I know what love really is," she said. "And I know what I'm willing to do to protect it." Daniel nodded slowly, and she could see understanding in his eyes. Not pity, she would have hated pity, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement of one survivor to another. "Get some rest," he said, feeding more wood to the fire. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Leiran settled back against the wall, pulling her son closer. For the first time in days, she felt something that might have been hope. It was fragile and uncertain, like a flame in the wind, but it was there. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small shelter, warmth and safety held back the darkness. And for now, that was enough. What we had wasn't love, it was something else, something predetermined. Daniel's expression shifted, though she couldn't quite read it. "Sounds like you never had a choice." A bitter laugh escaped her. Choice was never part of it. She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. Maybe it was the fire, the exhaustion, or the way he listened without judgment, or maybe it was because for the first time she didn't feel like she had to explain herself. A shiver ran through her, last remnants of the cold still clinging to her skin. She rubbed her arms, but it did little to help. Daniel let out a low sigh and grabbed something from his pack, a blanket thick and well worn here. Tossed it toward her. She caught it reflexively, fingers tightening around the fabric. "Take it," he said. "You're still freezing." She hesitated. Accepting help from him felt like crossing a line. Shackled and uncross, but her body ached with exhaustion, and the cold was relentless. Pulled the blanket around her shoulders, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you," muttered. Daniel only nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't press. He just leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes as if the conversation had never happened. Liam watched him for a long moment. She had spent her life being told that humans were dangerous, that they were violent and cruel, ruled by primitive instincts, but this one had saved her, had fed her, had given her warmth without asking for anything in return. She looked down at her hands, her fingers still stiff from the cold. She rubbed them together, trying to summon heat that no longer existed in her body. Then, without a word, Daniel reached over and took her hands in his. Lian inhaled sharply, instinct telling her to pull away. But she didn't. His hands were rough, calloused, larger than hers, but they were warm, steady. He held hers gently between his own, rubbing slow circles against her frozen skin, coaxing life back into her fingers. A lump formed in her throat, It was such a simple thing, no expectation or demand, just warmth. Freely given, she looked up at him, and for the first time she saw something beyond the human she had been taught to fear. He wasn't a brute. He wasn't a Mindels warrior. He was just a man. And for the first time since she had been cast away from her people, she didn't feel completely alone. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world. Outside, blanketed in silence, inside the shelter, the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows. Across the cold metal walls, the scent of melted snow and lingering smoke filled the air, mixing with something else, something quieter, something neither of them wanted to name. Loran sat near the fire, her sun curled against her small body, rising and falling in deep, steady sleep. He had warmed considerably in the last few hours, his green skin no longer tinged with the dull grey of the cold. She ran her fingers gently through his dark hair, a habit from when he was smaller, when she had been certain she could protect him from everything, but she hadn't protected him from this. She glanced up at the man across from her. Daniel sat with his back against Thule, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate movements, the way he always did when his thoughts were elsewhere, his presence still unsettled. Her not because she feared him, but because she didn't. She should fear his strength, his unpredictability, the way he moved throughout this frozen world like he was made for it. But instead all she could think about was the way he had given them warmth without hesitation, the way he had fought him. The way right now he looked up from his blade and met her gaze, with something she couldn't quite name. A long silence stretched between them, before Daniel finally broke it. "You never told me your name." Loran blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, Heffert wasn't one of them. She hesitated, the instinct to guard herself still strong, still ingrained. But what was the point? He had already seen her at her weakest. He had carried her son when she could not. He had sat with her in silence when there was nothing left to say. Leon. The word felt strange coming from her own lips, as if she had forgotten how to say it. How long had it been since Simeon had spoken her name without judgment, without the weight of exile attached to it? Daniel nodded slightly. He was turning the sound of it over in his mind, testing how it fit, and him. He tilted his head toward the boy sleeping in her lap. Leon looked down at her son, the most fragile thing she had ever known, and yet the reason she was still breathing. She brushed a strand of hair from his face. "Say." Daniel was quiet for a moment, as if committing both names to memory. Then, to her surprise, he gave her something in return. "Daniel." She looked at him sharply. He smirked just a little, figured it's only fair. Leon didn't know why that made something tighten in her chest. She exhaled slowly, shifting Sir's weight in her lap. "I wasn't meant to be here," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "My people, when we bond, it's not just emotional. It's biological compression, reinforced by chemical compatibility." She kept her eyes on the fire. "When one dies, the other follows. It's always been that way." Daniel's brow furrowed. "That's a messed up way to live." Lan almost laughed. "Almost. It's not our belief. It's nature. Or at least that's what we were. We're told." The fire crackled between them. Daniel's expression darkened. "So when your mate died, I expected you to die too, yet. But you didn't know." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "And they exiled you for it?" She nodded. "They thought something was wrong with me, that my bond was weak, that I was unnatural." The word tastes bitter. "I thought so too for a long time." Daniel studied her, his gaze steady and readable. Then finally he spoke. "It's not how love works." Leon's breath caught. Love. She had never used that word before, not for what she had with her mate, not for the thing that had been decided for her, written into her biology before she ever had a choice. She had been taught that her bond was unbreakable, that the chemicals in her blood would dictate her feelings, would make them real. But if that had been true, she would have died with him. Instead, she had lived, not because she loved him, but because she didn't. The fire flickered between them, but it was no longer the only warmth in the room. Daniel shifted slightly, Restingus. Arms on his knees sounds like you never had a choice, he murmured, ahumorless. Smile tugged at Leanne's lips. Choice was never part of it. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Yeah, well, maybe it should have been. She didn't know how to respond to that. She only knew that for the first time in her life. She wasn't afraid of what? She felt her of what she didn't. A shiver ran through her. Though this time it wasn't from the cold. Daniel noticed it immediately, without hesitation. He reached for his pack, pulling out another blanket he hesitated only briefly before. Leaning forward and draping it around her shoulders himself, his fingers brushed her collarbone as he adjusted the fabric, a fleeting touch warm despite the cold. Lauren inhaled sharply. She should have pulled away, she didn't. Daniel didn't move his hands still resting lightly against her shoulders. He was close now, close enough that she could see the roughness of his skin, the way the firelight cast shadows along his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then slowly he lifted a hand and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her pulse stuttered. She didn't know what startled her more, that he had done it, or that she had let him. Daniel's gaze flickered towards searching. He didn't pull away neither. Did she? Her throat felt tighter. Chest too full. She had spent her entire life believing that love was something predetermined, something decided by biology. That this was different. This was something real, something she had never been given the chance to choose. And for the first time she thought maybe she would. The first sign of danger was the sound, a low mechanical hum that barely registered beneath the howling wind at first. Lan thought it was her imagination. Just the storm shift across the ice playing tricks on her exhausted mind. But then Daniel tensed beside her, head tilting slightly, his expression sharpening. He heard it too. She turned toward the sound just as the sky split open with piercing white light. The deep resonant hum of thrusters filled the air, growing louder as a sleek silver vessel descended from the darkness, its metallic hull gleaming against the frozen landscape. Her breath caught in her throat. They had found her. Instinct took over. She grabbed, saw pulling him close as a wave of panic surged through her body. Daniel was already moving, rising to his feet with practiced ease, his hand going to his weapon, his gaze flicked toward her. Friends of yours, his voice war steady, but there was an edge to it. Leon's stomach twisted. No, the ship landed smoothly. A testament to VAR and engineering. It was small, not a warship, but it didn't need to be. VAR and enforcers weren't soldiers. They were something far more efficient, executions who never carried weapons because they never needed them. A sharp hiss cut through the night as Thelanding RP extended from the ship's cold interior. Figures emerged, their long cloaks rippling in the icy wind. Their presence was like a wound against the frozen wasteland, too precise, too controlled, untouched by the elements that had nearly killed her. Leon recognized them immediately. They weren't there to negotiate. Daniel stood firm beside her, his stance shifting slightly, a predator sizing up the threat before him. He didn't reach for his knife yet, but she could feel the tension rolling off him, coiling just beneath the surface. Lead enforcers stepped forward, his silver eyes assessing her with cool detachment. His face was familiar, one of the elder emissaries, a man who had once spoken Herfit as if it were nothing more than an administrative detail. You are difficult to find, he said smoothly. Laram swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Yao shouldn't have come. He ignored the statement. His gaze flicked to Saw, still bundled against her chest. His expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his posture, a quiet calculation. You know why we are Haresh did. Lian had never been meant to survive when her mate had died. She was supposed to have followed. That was the way of their people, the unbreakable law written into their very biology. The fact that she hadn't, that she had lived, made her an anomaly, a threat. And threats were not allowed to exist. We assumed you perished in the storm. The enforcer commented, tilting his head slightly. It seems we were mistaken. Liran tightened her hold on Sarai, instinct screaming at her to run. But there was nowhere to go, not going back. She said, the enforcer's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. You misunderstand. You were never meant to return. A slow, crawling cold spread through her chest. Daniel took a single step forward, his presence like a wall between her and the enforcers. You want to explain what the hell that means? The lead enforcer barely glanced at him, his gaze flicking over Daniel like he wasn't worth acknowledgement. He exhaled softly, as if indulging a lesser being. She is an error in our system, he said, an error that must be corrected. Lan's pulse pounded in her ears. They weren't here to take her back, they were here to erase her. She had expected this moment deep down. She had known from the second she defied the natural order that her people would never let her exist. But knowing didn't make it easier. Daniel shifted again, his stance no longer merely defensive, but poised for something more. You're saying you came all this way just to kill her? Fear was something lethal in his voice, now something quiet and dangerous. The enforcer studied him for a moment before giving a slow nod. Correct, the word barely left his lips before Daniel moved in one fluid motion. He grabbed the enforcer by the front of his cloak, yanking him forward and slamming him against the hull of the ship with enough force to crack the ice beneath them. The other enforcers stiffened, but none of them moved. Yet you're not taking them. Daniel's voice was low, steady, but beneath it was something far more dangerous than anger. It was certainty. The enforcer remained calm despite the blade now resting just below his throat. Step aside. Daniel pressed that knife in just slightly, not enough to break skin, but enough to be a warning. Not going to happen. A flicker of something passed through the enforcer's silver eyes. Not fear, but something close, confusion. He had expected submission. He had expected in a tabula. He had underestimated what humans were willing to do for the people they cared about. Leon couldn't breathe. This should tell Daniel to stop. She should de-escalate before this turned into something worse, but she didn't. Because for the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her, not because they were bound by biology, not because they had been programmed to, because they chose to. The fire crackled weakly in the distance, barely holding on against the night. The enforcer sighed, glancing toward his subordinates. Stand down. The other enforcers hesitated. Them one by one they lowered their hands. Daniel didn't move. His blade remained where it was. Let him go, Laran said softly. A long pause. Then Daniel exhaled sharply and released his grip, stepping back. The enforcer straightened, adjusting his cloak. With careful precision he met Lan's gaze, his expression unreadable. You will not be pursued again, he said. As far as our people are concerned, you no longer exist. Leon felt something deep inside her crack open. She had thought she would feel relief when this moment came, but instead all she felt was the weight of finality. She had been erased. The enforcers turned, retreating up the ramp. Without another word, the others followed, their movements lent and controlled. A moment later, the ship's thrusters roared back to life, and then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they were gone. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Lyrian let out a slow, shaky breath. Daniel turned to her, his gaze up. Are you okay? She looked down at Say, still safe in her arms, then at Daniel standing there like an immovable force between her and the rest of the universe. She swallowed hard. I think I am. She wasn't sure if it was the truth, but for the first time she wanted it to be. The wind had died, but the silence it left behind was worse. Leon stood frozen. Soria clutched against her chest, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. The bodies of the raiders lay still in the snow, their blood seeping into the ice dark and glistening beneath the pallid glow of the twin moons. And Daniel was still standing, but just barely. His knife slipped from his fingers, landing soundlessly in the snow. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, and when he swayed, Laran lurched forward. Before she even realized she was moving, she caught him just as his legs buckled, lowering him carefully onto the frozen ground. His weight was heavy against her, his body unnaturally warm despite the frigid air. Lan's fingers found the wound at his side, sticky with fresh blood. Too much blood. Her throat tightened. You're an idiot. Daniel huffed out a weak laugh. Not the first time I've heard that today. She pressed harder against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Stay awake. His lips curled slightly. Why you worried about me? Yes, she didn't say it. She couldn't. Instead, she scowled, reaching for the torn remnants of her cloak. You're not dying her, Daniel. His Gaze flickered up to her, something unreadable passing through high sighs. You only use my name when you're serious. I am serious. He let out a breathless of a laugh this time, and more of a sigh. His hand lifted, brushing against the wrist just barely. Just enough for her to feel the roughness of his skin warmth beneath the cold lan. His voice was quieter, no softer. We won. She shook her head, not yet. The exhaled, again eyes fluttering closed for half a second too long. Panic surged through her. She grabbed his face, forcing his gaze back to hers. Stay with me, she ordered. His eyes opened. Hazy but still focused. Bossy, he muttered. But there was no real fight in words. Lian pressed a makeshift bandage to his side, ignoring the way her hands trembled. You really don't know when to shut up, do you? Daniel smirked, or at least tried to nope. She swallowed against the tightness in her chest, against the fear threatening to swallow her whole. She had nearly lost him, and the realization of it was unbearable. Leon, he murmured again, his voice rougher. Now wake her. She met his gaze, and something shifted between them. The world always told her what love was supposed to be. Biological, chemical, and inevitability. But this was something else entirely. Something. Chosen Daniac fingers found her wrist again, this time curling around it, anchoring himself to her. She shuddered at the warmth of his touch, at the way it sent something unfamiliar through her veins. Something raw, terrifying, and completely illyrial her. Breath hitched when his thumb traced slow, deliberate circles against the skin. He was studying her now, searching her face like he was looking for something just shaken. He murmured, so are you. She countered, voice barely above a whisper, exhaled. His hand moving up her arm, trailing warmth in its wake. Leon. She didn't stop him, didn't pull away when his fingers slid up to cup her cheek, when his thumb brushed against the corner of her lips. She had never been out like this before, or never been allowed to want it. But she did desperately. She leaned in before she could stop herself, her breath mingling with his, the space between them vanishing. Their foreheads touched first, then their noses. Then finally his lips. It was tentative at first, soft, cautious, as if giving her the chance to stop, to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed closer, her fingers tangling in the fabric of his coat, pulling him to her. Daniel let out a low, shuddering breath against her mouth before kissing her. Deeper, slower, like he had been waiting for this. Like he had been waiting for her. Leon wasn't sure how long they stayed like that, tangled in warmth despite the cold, and something fragile yet unbreakable. But when they finally broke apart, Daniel smiled. Small, tired, but real. And Leon knew without a doubt that she had made her choice. The night was eerily silent, the bodies off. They raiders lay motionless in the snow, their blood dark against the ice, already beginning to freeze beneath the cold grip of the wind. The battle was over, the danger had passed. But Leon couldn't move because Daniel was still bleeding. She pressed a trembling hand against his wound, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through her, fingers staining the fabric of his coat. He sat against a jagged slab of ice, his breathing uneven, his face paler than she had ever seen it. For the first time since she had met him, he looked fragile, but terrified. Her, stay awake, she ordered, pressing down harder. Daniel let out a sharp breath. That smirk he gave her was still there. Still him. I don't know, bossy. Leon iskined of growing on me. She scowled. This isn't funny. Feels pretty funny. He winced, but somehow managed to chuckle. Like someone shoving a knife in my side. Oh wait, she glared at him. I swear if you die on me after everything, I will what kill me. He let his head rest back against the ice, smirking up at her, despite the pain in his eyes. Bite redundant. Don't you think? Leon's throat tight. He was joking, because that's what Danielle did. He laughed in the face of danger, smirked at death. But this time she could see the exhaustion creeping into his body, the weight of his injuries dragging him down. He was losing too much blood, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the bandages, trying to secure them as tightly as possible. His body was warm beneath her touch, too warm. Fever already setting in. This isn't working, she whispered, frustration thick in her voice. Danielle studied her, his gaze softer now, She froze as she swallowed, of course. I'm scared you're bleeding out in the middle of nowhere. And I don't have a way to stop it, he hummed. Something dangerous to amusement in his voice. So you do care? Liam sucked in a sharp breather hands. Stilling against his side, he blinked at her, the teasing fading slightly at the way she said his name. There was no anger in her voice. This time no exasperation, just raw, unfiltered fear. And something else, something she wasn't ready to name. She exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around his coat. "You can't die." His expression softened further. "I wasn't planning on it, that's not what." Aisha closed her eyes, inhaling slowly, then met his gaze again, this time with a hesitation. "You can't die. I won't let you for once." Daniel didn't have a smarter mark instead. He reached up his hand, rough and calloused, and cued her cheekliran. Froze, his thumb traced along her skin, a slow, deliberate motion that sent warmth curling through her, pushing back the cold that had settled in her bones. Touch was gentle, despite everything. Despite the fight, despite the pain, despite the fact that he was the one bleeding out. He still comforted her, her breath hitched. She had spent her whole life believing that love was something predetermined, something dictated by biology and chemistry, that it was something that happened to Yonat, something you chose. But this moment, this feeling was entirely hers. There was no bond forcing her toward him. No neural connection making her feel this way. She chose him, and she would keep choosing him. Daniel's fingers moved, slipping into her hair, tangling there. Ash pulled her closer, not forcefully, never forcefully. Just enough to let her know that he wanted this, that he wanted her. And she didn't pull away, didn't stop herself when she leaned in, when her forehead brushed against his, when their breaths mingled in the cold, his lips were chapped, rough but warm. When they finally met hers, the kiss was slow, hesitant at first, as if neither of them quite believed this was real. But when Leon's fingers tightened in his coat, pulling him closer, Daniel responded instantly, tilting his head to deepen the kiss. It wasn't perfect, it was messy, uneven. Both of them too exhausted, too caught in the weight of everything that had happened, but it was real. And when they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the frigid air, Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. "So, does this mean you like me?" Livram groaned, dropping her forehead against his shoulder. "You ruin everything," he grinned. Not everything, she huffed, but she didn't move away. Didn't let go for the first time. Since she had been exiled, since she had been cast out into the cold to die, she didn't feel alone. She had fought to survive. And now for the first time she wanted to live. With fire crackled softly, its golden glow casting flickering shadows against the shelter's walls. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unreal after everything they had been through. The air inside was warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and melting ice. Laran sat close to Daniil, her fingers resting lightly against his bandaged side. He was healing slowly, stubbornly, as he always did. The makeshift wraps were still stained with dried blood, but the worst of the danger had passed. His body was warm beneath her touch, solid and alive. Life, the words settled deep in her chest, a quiet relief she hadn't let herself feel until now. Across from them, Saw was curled up in the thick folds of Daniel's coat, his small green fingers clutching the fabric like it was the safest thing in the world. His steady even breathing filled the silence, and every now and then he let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly in his sleep. Lan ran a gentle hand through his dark hair, brushing it back from his forehead. He had been quiet since the fight, clinging to her, with a silent understanding that things had changed. But tonight he had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep for the first time in too long. Her son felt safe. She exhaled slowly, her fingers still absently tracing over Daniel's side. He was watching her no-whisk gaze, softer than she had ever seen it. "You should rest," he murmured. Lan shook her head. "I can't." Daniel raised an eyebrow, still worried about me. She had not quite able to bite back a smile. "You have a talent for getting yourself nearly killed." His lips twitched. "And yet I am." She gave him a pointed look, barely. His smirk softened, and without thinking he reached up, brushing his fingers along her jaw. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent warmth curling through her all the same. Her heart stumbled. Daniel's hand slid up his tongue, tracing just beneath her cheekbones. Slow and deliberate. "You never told me," he murmured. Laran swallowed. "Told you what?" His fingers brushed against her temple, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "If you were going to kill me yourself." She blinked, confused for half a second before realizing what he was referring to, the words she had spat at him earlier in the fight. "If you die on me, I will kill you myself." Eat crept up her neck. "You were being an idiot," he hummed, amused, and now she held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly where they rested against him. Now she hesitated, her pulse thrumming loud in her ears. Now she couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't there. Now the thought of losing him made her chest ache in a way she had never known before. Now there was no denying what she had been too afraid to name. Daniel's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Something quiet and waiting. He was giving her space, giving her time. But she didn't want time anymore. Laran leaned in before she could second-guess herself, closing the space between them. His breath hitched just before their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but when her fingers slid up to tangle in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, Daniel responded in kind, his good arm wrapped around her, anchoring her against him, his lips parting just enough to let her deepen the kiss. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't desperate. It was a promise, one made in silence, with nothing but warmth and the quiet certainty of what had always been growing between them. And they finally peeled away, their breaths mingling in the space between them. Daniel exhaled a quiet chuckle. He murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm taking this as confirmation that you do like me." Laran rolled her eyes, but she didn't pull away. "I swear you ruin everything," he grinned. "Not everything." A sleepy mumble from across the fire made them both turn. Sir shifted, rubbing at his eyes as he slowly blinked. Awake, his violet gaze flickered between them, still as with sleep, before a wide, drowsy smile stretched across his small face. "Mama happy?" he mumbled. Liran held sharply. Her son had seen too much, felt too much fear for someone so small. He had clung to her through every storm, through every night spent in the cold, through every uncertainty of whether they would live to see another sunrise. And yet here he was asking if she was happy. He swallowed the lump in her throat and then leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm happy, sir." Made a content little sound before curling deeper into Daniel's coat, already drifting back to sleep. Lyran exhaled, her heart impossibly full. Daniel was watching her again, his gaze softer than she had ever seen. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. She could feel it for the first time in her life. She wasn't afraid of what came next. For the first time she had something more than just survival. She had them, and she would never let go.